So let's talk about how you can build an SDK in PHP. We're going to walk through the steps that it takes for you to build an SDK in the PHP programming language from scratch. So let's get started. The first thing that you want to do is create a composer.json file. This is what PHP will use to understand how to deal with your package when installing it into a different application. We always start with a name, and we're going to call this Speakeasy API PHP SDK template. We'll add a quick description, and that's just going to be a template SDK in PHP. Nothing exciting. Then we want to add in our license, which for this case will be an MIT license. Then we're going to move on to require. Now what require is it tells Composer Package Manager what dependencies you might need. And we're going to have a dependency of PHP 8.3 on this, so that anyone installing our SDK in a lower version will not be able to do so without a warning. Next, we want to add our autoload. And what autoload does is it allows us to load in our package class names really nicely. And for this, we're going to use PSR4. We're going to call our namespace Acme, which is, I suppose, common in tutorials. And we're going to map that to the source directory. So our next step is just to do a quick Composer update to make sure that Composer knows all about our Composer JSON changes. Now that we've got our Composer file ready, what we want to do is start to create parts of our SDK. And we're going to start with the SDK class itself. We're going to call it SDK, and the namespace will just be Acme. So we've got a final class SDK. Within the Acme namespace, we're declaring strict types. We've got some good coding standards straight out of the box. So the first thing we need to do is create a constructor. We've got a public function construct. And within here, we want to accept two different parameters. We're going to have a private read-only string property for the URL, and again, a private read-only string property for the token. And the token is going to be our API token that people might want to create and pass through. So we can actually make this class read-only because the properties are both read-only, which makes it a little bit easier for now. Now we're going to add some accessors. So we've got the public function URL method, which is just going to return that URL as a string so that it can be accessed outside of the SDK class. And again, we're going to do the same thing with the token, just to make things clean, easy, and consistent. And that's it. That's our SDK started. Next up, what we want to do is create a test file so that we can understand how our SDK is to work with as we're building it. I like to do this because it enables me to feel the pain what other people will feel while they're integrating. So we're just going to require vendor autoload and start building our SDK. So our SDK is a new SDK where we're going to pass through the URL, which is api.something.com, and the token is just 1234. Nice and simple. This is demo purposes. So now we've got our SDK, we know we can new it up, and it's quite clean. There's not much more we need to do with it at this stage. So let's go ahead and start creating our resources within this resources directory. The first one is going to be the product resource. We're going to want to list out products from the API. To access it, it will come through the SDK, so we need to add a method on the SDK called products, which will return a new instance of that product resource. And there we go. Now let's see how that feels. If we say products is equal to SDK products, and then we'll be able to tap on methods such as list, create, lots of different methods that might be what we need within our SDK. But we're going to focus in on this list one mostly. And we're probably going to want to sort. So let's create a directory for an enum. And what we're going to have here is some strict sorts. We're going to create a sort enum. And what this is going to allow us to do is add on query parameters based on sorts. And we use an enum like this because it's a lot cleaner and it keeps less floating string variables throughout your code base. So we can have a case for the price, and then we can also have a case for the age, which is just going to be the created at. And what we can do with this is if we come back to our test PHP, when we pass this through, we can say we want to sort on the price, and we want the direction to be descending, for example. We want to sort everything based on descending on the price. And our API should respond from that quite easily. So sort and direction are only one part of the puzzle. Very useful, but what we now want to look at doing is to work on these resources themselves. To add the behavior that I like to these resources, I like to add traits because it allows me to compose my resource classes as required. So this one here is a can create requests, and it's going to contain methods that every resource class is going to need. So we want to say we want to be able to create a request where we pass through the method and a URL. To do this part, we're going to install a package. Composer require just Steve King /SDK tools. It's got a lot of helper packages within there, and we want to make sure that we allow HTTP factory auto discovery within this so our client can be detected. We're going to type hint to a method enum, and we're just going to type hint a string for the URL. Finally, we're going to return a request interface from the PSR library. We can leverage something such as the PSR 17 factory. The request factory, and then automatically create a request on that. We can pass through the method value and the URL itself. To clean this up though, we are going to add some named parameters because it keeps our code clean and consistent throughout the SDK. Let's type in that method and now the URL itself. So this will allow us to create a PSR compatible request to send to an API. What we want to do is on our product resource, we want to add a constructor because each resource should accept the SDK as an argument. So we're going to have a protected SDK as SDK. So come back to our SDK and let's just make sure that we pass that through as this. We're going to add a quick mix in for static analysis purposes here. And for now, we're just going to type hint it to product resource. We don't have any shared functionality yet, so we're just going to keep to this one. We can now make some changes to this and say we want to get this SDK URL and then slash the URL that we've actually passed into the method itself. So we're always pulling the base URL from the SDK itself. As you can see, nothing's changed there, but we need to make sure we don't include that / just so that we don't double up on the slashes and cause routing errors inside the API itself. So our next step is going to be to create an interface for each of our resources to implement. We're going to store this in a contracts directory, and we're going to call this one just resource contract. We're following a Laravel convention here. Now, what we want to do is we want to be able to create a request on every resource. So if we copy the method signature from the trait, we can add this into our contract. Now let's make sure that our product resource implements this resource contract. And we can see that it needs to implement the request method. We're not going to add that just yet. Next, we're going to create another trait, and we're going to call this one Can Access SDK. We're going to take the constructor from our resource, and we're going to keep that within the Can Access SDK. This time, we're going to add the mix-in for the resource contract, now that we've got that shared behavior. We add new public function SDK so that we can always access the SDK underneath inside other traits. And this will just return the SDK that's been bound through the constructor. Now let's make sure that we add that method to our contract and delete the constructor from our current resource. As you can see, we're not able to resolve that interface just yet. I'm just going to quickly update this can create requests to the resource contract for the mixin, update the URI on the creating request to this SDK method. And we're going to make the SDK private because it's not really required anywhere else. It can also be read-only. So the way that our resource will access this or be built up is to use these concerns, these traits. We want to use can access SDK and use can create requests, which will resolve any issues with implementing the interface itself. As you can see on our test code, nothing's changed. Our resource is good to go. We can start adding methods and start doing what we want to do with our business logic for accessing API resources. Let's start with the public function list. Now this is going to return a collection, but we haven't installed that package yet. Let's jump to our terminal and install this package now. We're going to composer require Ramsey collection. It's very similar to other collection libraries, but I find the Ramsey one is really good for when you're building packages yourself. So now we can type in that collection and start working on the logic for listing. We're going to start creating our request by saying request is this request, passing through method get enum and the URI of /products. That will call through to the can create request trait, allowing us to create that PSR request that we want. So now that we've got our request, we want to look at building up those query parameters. Let's go back to our can create requests and we're going to add a new method called apply filters. So public function apply filters, and this is going to accept two things. Let's start by accepting the request interface, which is the request that we would have built up. And then we're going to accept an array of filters. We will be returning a new request out the other side of this method. What we do is we start by looping over the filters by saying for each filters as filter, and then we're just going to stub out return request at the end. For this to work, we need to make sure that we've got a filter class available. So let's go ahead and create that under resources filters directory, and we're going to create a new class called filter. We're going to remove the final keyword for now and see what we need to do. We're going to start with a public function construct. Inside this constructor, we want two arguments. We want private read-only string for the key, and then private read-only mixed for the value. The value could be a boolean, an integer, a float, a string. So we're going to stick with mixed instead of declaring all the different types that we could have. Next up, we're going to create a public function to query parameter. And this is, for now, we're just going to return an array of what this filter would look like as a query parameter. And this will just be returning an array where this key is this value. Let's just add some doc blocks quickly. We're going to do an array of string and mixed. Add some doc blocks on the constructor as well. And we can make the filter class read-only and final. So what we'll do now for the final part is we're going to create a static constructor. So public static function make. And this is going to accept a string for the key and mixed for the value. And it will return a new filter, a little bit like a factory method. This will just return new filter, where the key is the key that we passed in, and the value is the value that we passed in. Let's just add some dot blocks, keep it consistent, come back to our can create requests, and let's just add the dot block and type hint this array of filters, which is going to be an array of filters with no key specified, so it'll be an int filter array. Let's get the URI by saying request get URI, and then what we want to do on this is we've got the URI interface from the request, and what we want to do is looping over each filter, we want to build up what that URI is going to be. So we're going to say query equals filter to query parameter. Now at the moment that is going to be an array, which probably isn't what we want here. We probably want to maybe turn it into a string that we can pass through. So let's go and update this to query parameter to something that's actually going to be useful for us here. Change the return type to a string, delete that doc block, re-add it as a string. Let's update this method so that it returns this key is equal to this value. And we just use some string interpolation there. Now, this toQuery parameter will give us back the string that we want. So we can say that the URI is equal to URI with query. And the query that we want to pass through is going to be filter to query parameter. That's allowing us to slowly build up with each iteration through the filters. Finally, we're going to return request with URI, passing through the newly built URI that we've built up from all of the filters itself. And we're just going to add on a preserve host to make sure that no funny business happens within the filters to override the base URL. So now coming back to our product resource, we now want to actually work with some filters. So inside the list method, let's accept an array of filters as an empty array by default. We also want to accept null sort as the sort. We're going to default that to null. And finally, let's add a null string for the direction, which is going to default to null as well. Let's work through these filters now. So we can say request equals this apply filters. Let's pass through the request that we just built. And let's pass through the filters that we've accepted on our method. We're going to grab this request up here and inline it inside the apply filters just for cleanliness. There's no point creating the request twice there, is there? So let's remove that one and let's just keep it within the apply filters so that we're not wasting temporary variables for no reason. We've got the method get, we've got the products, and we've got the filters. Now if we have a look at our test, we can say filters, and let's just do an array. And within here, we're going to create a filter, we're going to say that the key price, and that the value for the price is going to be 1000. Let's just drop all of these arguments on the list method to a new line, because now we want to look at pagination. With pagination, there's so many different options. We could build a manual pagination class or doing a do while loop, but I prefer to do something like this where I add a page into the method for listing. If the page isn't null, then we want to add on another query parameter. So we can say request is equal to the request get URI with query, passing through the query of page equals page that is passed into the method. This allows programmatic control instead of the method automatically paginating for you or having to wrap it in a helper class. So we're just going to get a URI back from that, and we're just going to reassign the request to the request with URI, passing through the URI with the amended pagination data, preserving the host again. At this point, we've got our request. It's been built up based off of a get method using products, passing through any filters. If there's pagination required, then we're going to add that as well. And this would be in our test method, we could say page 12 or page 1, for example. If you're using this SDK within a framework, for example, Laravel, we might do something like this. We might say request get page and tie that into the page method that we're calling on the SDK, so that we're binding our application pagination with our SDK pagination. We want to start looking at the HTTP client that's attached to our SDK. We're going to add a private array of plugins to our SDK because we're going to use the PSR18 plugin client for this. We want to remove the read-only from the SDK and add it back to the URL and token properties because we want to be able to modify the plugins programmatically. Next up, let's add a method called withPlugins, which is going to accept an array of plugins that we can use to attach to our SDK to the HTTP request we're about to send. This makes it nice and easy to work with, and we're going to return this so it's chainable. Just add some doc blocks here, and we want to typecast this to an int plugin, which is the plugin interface. Next up, we're going to add a new method, so public function default plugins, and this is just going to return an array. So we want a new retry plugin, but that's not installed yet. So we need to go to our terminal to install the correct package here. We'll do a composer require on PHP HTTP/client common. This contains a few things that are really useful when building SDKs. So we want the retry plugin so failures can automatically be retried. We're going to add the new error plugin, which handles errors gracefully, and the new authentication plugin. And with the authentication, I'm just going to hard code this for now. We're going to add a bearer token, which is going to call this token to get the token that's attached to the SDK. And that is our default plugins. You can go a lot further, but as a default, this is typically what I stick with. Now, if we come back up to with plugins, we want to be able to update this because we want to assign this plugins to the result of an array merge. And that's going to get the default plugins as well as any plugins that are passed through. This allows us to keep our default plugins and only have them overridden if we want to actually override them by passing them through to with plugins. Next up, we're going to create an interface for our SDK. We're adding a few methods now, so we might want to get to the point where we want an interface that we can bind to a container to resolve out later on. So we'll pull up the SDK next to the interface, and let's just copy some of these methods across to make it a little bit easier. We're going to want to add the with plugins. We're going to want to add the default plugins. And we're going to want the URL and token. So the products method isn't a requirement on the contract. That's an implementation detail. But any time that we resolve an SDK contract, we should be able to work with the plugins, get the URL and get the token. We're going to add one more method here called client, which is going to return the client interface that is currently bound. So if we come over to our SDK again, we're going to implement the SDK contract now, which means we need to add that new method. So let's scroll down roughly to the right place and let's say public function client is going to return a client interface. So if we take this auto-generated doc out, we're going to return a new plugin client, which will resolve that client interface. And the HTTP client underneath, we're going to use a PSR18 client discovery to find the installed version. And then plugins, we're going to call this plugins. This means that we're going to get a PSR18 HTTP client with the plugins that we've defined, and everything will just work nicely. So let's just call default plugins for now, just to make it simpler. So our next step really is being able to set the client. Now, it's really useful having the client available by default through PSR18 auto discovery, but if we add a private nullable client interface as into the constructor and set the default to null, it means that while we can discover in the container itself, it can be bound directly. But for certain scenarios, it's not useful. You want to set the client directly. So let's add that set client method, which accepts the client and will return the SDK so it's chainable. So we can say this client equals client and return this. This allows all of our HTTP configuration to now work. We can get the client, we can get the HTTP client transport that's underneath the plugin client. We can get the plugins, and now we just want to grab that new method and just add it underneath client there so that it's part of the interface as well. So let's create some DTOs, which are data transfer objects. We're going to create a product object now. And what this is going to be is an object representation of the content that comes back in the response. So let's create our constructor. Inside here, we're going to have a public string SKU. We have a public string for the name, string for the description, and an int for the price. Just some defaults, and we're going to make this a read-only class. There's no point adding it on the properties when the whole class is just a plain old PHP object. Now we want to add a public static function make here. We want to be able to take that response data, which we'll get as an array, and we want to turn that into a product. So that static make method is a little bit like a factory. It statically creates the product DTO for us. So inside this make, we're going to want to do a little bit of mapping. So let's create a new object mapper using reflection, which is a PHP league package. And then what we want to do is return the mapper. And then what we want to do is hydrate an object. So mapper, hydrate object. All we need to do here is pass through the class name, which is obviously the class that we're on now, and the properties, which is the data that is passed through to this method. And that will return a new product nicely. We can quickly inline that one to make it a little bit cleaner. Just add some dot blocks. And what we're going to do, we're going to add an array shape here so that we've got a little bit more type awareness with our arrays. So SKU string, name string, and description string, finally int price. So that we get type hints for each part of the array as it's going in. It can pre-validate based on static analysis. Now, if we come back to this product resource, what we now want to do is actually send the request and return a collection of the objects. So we're going to try to get a response. So try response is equal to this SDK get the client and send a request. The request is a request that we've been building up. And that's all we need to do there. Now we want to add a catch to this try, and we're going to catch anything that is throwable as an exception. A number of things could go wrong at this point, so it's best to just catch that throwable interface, make it a little bit easier. We'll create a new directory here inside the root directory called exceptions, and these are going to be for SDK specific exceptions. So we're going to create a new one called failed to fetch products, which will extend default exception. And the reason for this is that it's going to give us a very contextually useful exception if we do get one. So we'll throw a new failed to fetch products. We're going to pass in a message, and this message is just going to be failed to fetch product list from the API. And we're going to pass back the previous so that our error tracing is all done nice and clean. Finally, we're going to return a new collection, and the collection type is going to be of a product. And the data that we're going to pass through is a result of an array map. We're going to map over the content from the response. We're going to throw the failed to fetch products, not return it. There we go. So this array map, what we want to do here is we want to have a callable, and we want to have an array. The array is going to be the array cast JSON encode of the response itself. So we're going to say response get body, then get contents. So that's going to give us that raw JSON string. We're going to mark it as associative, so it is going to return an array, but we're still typecasting just to be sure. Finally, flags, we're going to throw on error. So should JSON encode decode fail for any reason, throw an exception. Finally, the callback, we're going to iterate over the array, which for now we're just going to call data, and this should return a product each time. So the result of this callable is going to be product make, and the data being passed through is the data being passed into the callback. And we can make that static because it's not calling any parent methods. That is mostly done. We're not doing sort or direction right now. Very similar to filters. So let's see where we've gone wrong here. We embedded that in the wrong place. So let's just fix that quickly. We want to finish building the request before we try and send it. So if we don't pass a page, that wouldn't have sent. Oops. We all make mistakes. So once we've built up that request, we can try and get a response. Fantastic. Then we send the request, catch potential exceptions, throwing a contextually aware exception. Finally, we're going to return a collection of a product, and the data we're passing through is a result of an array map on that response content, which we are JSON decoding and turning into a product DTO. Now let's create a new resource. We're going to create a customer resource because what we want to do alongside anything to do with products, we're going to want to create customers. So we're going to implement the resource contract on the customer resource. We're going to use our traits of can access SDK and can create requests. And the first method that we're going to focus on here is going to be the create method. We want to be able to create new customers. So public function create. Much like when we receive a response, we also want to create a DTO for creating a customer. So let's just create a customer DTO. Obviously, naming aside, you can name these things whatever makes sense to you. But to create a customer, we want a couple of properties. So inside our constructor, let's add a couple of properties that we need. We want a read-only string for the name, a read-only string for their email. We're going to add a read-only string for the referrer, where they came from, and we'll make the whole class read-only. They're the only properties, so let's add that static make method where we accept an array of data and return a customer. So we can return a new object mapper using reflection and then hydrate an object straight away. The class name is going to be the customer class, and the payload is going to be the data that is passed in. We can change that to self, a little bit cleaner. We can add the customer call to our SDK class, and it's going to return a new customer resource, passing in the SDK itself. So we can now add that customer's method, allowing us to call it. So inside this create, we want to accept a customer as an argument. So we want to accept a built object, and we're going to be able to return a customer back. So our request is going to be this request. The method is going to be a post this time, and the URL is just going to be /customers. Very restful. We're making up our API as we go along here. So now that our request is created, we want to be able to add a payload. So inside our can create requests, let's add a public function to attach a payload. This method is going to accept the request and a string for the payload. It will return a new request as well. Basically, all we're doing here is transforming the request. So we can say return request with body, and the body is going to be a PSR17 factory discovery, and we're going to find this stream factory. And then we're going to create a stream, the content of which is going to be the payload. And that is all it needs to do. Because PSR7 is immutable, we need to create a new one. So on the customer object, we now need to create a toString method, a way to turn our customer object into a string that we can send as a JSON body. So we're going to return JSON encode, we're going to cast it to a string, and the value that we're going to send through is going to be an array, and we're going to add the JSON throw an error flag as well. So what we're going to encode is going to be name mapping to this name, email to this email, and referrer to this referrer. This will turn our customer object into a JSON object, which is cast to a string, passing it through as a payload to the stream interface to add it as a request stream. Now we can override the request and say that request is equal to this attached payload. The request is going to be the request that we've built, and the payload is the customer to string. There's a potential exception there, but we'll ignore it for now. Next up, we want to try and get a response from the API by saying this SDK client send request, much like we did before, passing through the request as an argument. Again, we're going to catch an exception, which we're going to use a throwable interface as an exception. And let's go create a new exception specifically for this resource or this method. So new exception failed to create customer. Again, we'll extend the exception class. So now we want to throw a new failed to create customer. And the message that we're going to pass back this time is failed to create customer with name. And let's just pass that name back through. So customer name. Previous is just going to be an exception that we caught. So now we've got all of that. What we can do is return a new customer. So this response here is fine. We're actually going to return a Boolean, I think. That would make a lot more sense. So was this created? So bool, and right at the end, we can just return true. How you handle this in your SDKs is entirely up to you. So we're just going to return response, get the status code, and just make sure that it equals to HTTP created, which is 201. Just get the value on that enum as well. Let's test this out. If we aren't able to create the customer, so if SDK customers create, then down here we'll return some sort of failure message. Yeah, fail and try again. It might be on a retry queue. Inside the create, we're just going to say customer make, passing through an array directly of name, email, and referrer. And we're just going to say YouTube for the referrer for now. So that's how it looks. So if the SDK customer create is false, then fail and try again maybe. And that's how you create an SDK in PHP. You focus on the developer experience, allowing people to make decisions where they need to, but not enforcing them, but giving them the options to add their own components and make their own decisions where it makes sense.